Hi, I'm Adam Porter. I'm a board game designer from Wales, and on this channel I very frequently talk about board game design. Now, when we talk about design in the board game industry, what we're tending to talk about is creating the rules, creating the rule sets. So that's kind of my job. But there's this whole other area of design that's about the graphics, right? Graphic design, and that's somewhere where I have very little experience apart from my own sort of self-learned experience from making lots of prototypes over the years and kind of seeing for myself what works and what doesn't work. Now, I've been aware of this designer, Daniel Solis, for many years. And when I say designer for Daniel, I'm talking game designer and graphic designer. And he's written a book called Graphic Design for Board Games. So I reached out to Daniel specifically to ask if he could possibly send me a review copy, and he put me in touch with the publishers, and they did. So I've had this complimentary copy of Graphic Design for Board Games, and I've learned so much from it, which I knew I would. This is why I reached out to Daniel in the first place, because I knew that he's an expert, a master in this particular field. And I know that because I've played some of his games, and also because I've read this previous book, which is also by CRC Press. This was not a review copy, this one I actually purchased, at great cost, I should say. This is an expensive book. The Building Blocks of Tabletop Game Design, an Encyclopedia of Mechanisms by Jeff Engelstein and Isaac Shalev. Now, this is an excellent book about all the different sort of mechanisms that are out there in the board game world, and it breaks them down into types and so on. But the book is full of illustrations, detailed diagrams and icons for the various different mechanisms, and these illustrations are all done by Daniel Solis. They're excellent. They illustrate what can be done with icons and diagrams, and they were one of my favourite parts of the book. But I also knew Daniel from his games, specifically the games Kodama, which is this beautiful game where you're laying out cards to make trees, and you've got these little fantastical creatures, fairy type creatures and things in it. Really graphically appealing game. But also the game Trickster, which Daniel actually contacted me and sent me a review copy for a number of years ago when he saw my video about trick-taking games. So Trickster is a game, an unusual trick-taking game where the second card that is played into a trick kind of changes the rules for everybody else playing into that trick, and every individual card has loads of different special abilities on it. This isn't a review of the games of Daniel Solis, this is a review of his book, so we'll stick on this. Graphic Design for Board Games. I found this fascinating, this book. I don't know how to review a book. I've reviewed many board games over the years. I've never really reviewed a book, so I'm just going to ramble on about it. Right at the start of the book, it talks a lot about typography. That sounds really dull, doesn't it? It's not, it's fascinating, okay? I'd never really thought about typography in any great detail. I kind of knew that some games, I look at them and I don't like the font, right? Particularly old games, like, for example, the game Archaeology, the card game I've got in my collection, where it doesn't really matter how good the artwork is, and frankly it's not good, not in this particular edition, but the font is terrible as well, and it just makes the whole thing look cheap and old. And the same thing with Aladdin's Dragons, this little card game I've got here. Again, the font just seems, you know, badly chosen and not thought through, and it doesn't serve the game at all. It makes the whole thing look quite amateurish. If you look at very modern games, much more recent games, most of them are pretty slick actually with their font choices. But this word kept coming up in this book about serif, right? Serif fonts and sans serif fonts. Now, I've heard this word before, but it's not actually something that I understood. I didn't know what it meant. I've just heard the word or seen it in word processors. But serif means the little flowery bits that come off letters, right? So if you're using Times New Roman font, you've got all these little flowery bits that come off the edge of the letters, whereas if you're using Arial or Helvetica or I don't even know how to pronounce all of these fonts because I've only ever seen them written down. But if you're using those sorts of fonts, there's no flowery bits. It's straight down to business, just the letter and so on. And I've never really thought about when I might use one of those fonts and when I might use the other. I suppose I've always done it kind of intuitively one way or the other, and I've probably made tons of mistakes. But it's interesting to look at board games with that in mind and think, right, which ones do use serif and which ones use sans serif? You know, no flowery bits, and why? So for example, if we look at the recent game Mlem, Space Agency, it's obviously a science fiction game, and yeah, there's no fancy little serif bits in it, right? It's all sans serif, right? It's just plain straightforward lettering, whereas if we look at something a little bit more fantastical and sort of beautiful and flowery, like Far Shore, the Everdell sequel, yeah, we've got serif in there, okay? So we've got these little extra bits on the letters that make it look a little bit more storybook, right? And not quite so futuristic like we see in Mlem. So these are things that I've just never really thought about before. I've just kind of looked at fonts and thought, yeah, I'll go with that one, or I'll go with that one because I like it more than the other one. But actually there's more that goes into these decisions, or there should be, than that. And this book illustrates that really well. The next chapter in the book is all about iconography, which I guess is what I thought I was getting into when I bought a book or when I asked for a book on graphic design for board games. Icons seem to be such a major part of what we do when we design and when we're playing games. Going back to Daniel's game Trickster, it's got a whole series of icons. It's got text on there as well. So the cards have he's opted to use text and icons, and I guess the icons are there to catch at a glance, right, to know what that card does at a quick glance, but the words then detail it in case you don't understand the icon, you need to read it. And some of those icons are really simple, some of them are a little bit more complex, so you might use the text a little bit more. But what you find from those cards, and what he elaborates on in this book, is how he's created this sort of visual language. So if he's talking about you, the player, then the icon might be in white, but if he's talking about the opponent, it might be in grey or in black. And interestingly, when you look at the Trickster icons, some of them aren't really very thematic. So if he's talking about, you know, home, like your base, he's got a picture of a little house, and it's quite a quaint little house, not a futuristic house that would fit in with the Trickster universe. If he's talking about trashing a card or discarding a card, he might use a picture of a bin, and it's a very much a kind of a trash can or a garbage can that you might just see, you know, in someone's house in the modern day. Again, it's not futuristic, but you don't tend to notice because that's not what the icon's for. The icon is small, and it's there to make a very clear point very quickly. But again, he elaborates on those decisions, when that's appropriate, when it's not, when you might want to use a more thematic icon, and so on. I found myself with dilemmas around iconography when I was making my game Throne. So it was, in fact, it was a major part of the development of that through multiple prototypes. At various stages, I wanted to make that game completely language independent because I thought it might maximise my chances of getting a publisher to look at it, right? They don't want to produce lots of different language editions, was my thinking. They just want one edition they can sell to lots of different markets. So I tried to remove all text and represent everything with icons. But of course, I've got no basis in graphic design, no knowledge of it. I've never been on a course. I've never read a book on graphic design until this point. So creating icons which indicate that, you know, this die has been rolled, this die has not been rolled, this die belongs to the player, this die belongs to an opponent, and so on. It's difficult to come up with a separate icon for all those things that's intuitive, easy to read, and easy for players to just understand at a glance. And I'm not sure I succeeded. I then, of course, go into the process of putting together the game with a publisher. It was published by WizKids a number of years ago. And so a graphic designer came on board, and of course the graphic designer doesn't understand the game like I do, right? Nobody does. Nobody understands that game like I do. And so trying to work out what is the appropriate icon, the graphic designer will come up with something, and then I'll look at it and I'll see problems because that icon they've come up with might imply something else that relates to the game that they haven't fully understood. And so we go back and forth, and we end up with this system, this language for the game. And it's nothing like as good as the language that Daniel Solis came up for in Trickster. It's nothing like as coherent. But it was a really interesting experiment and experience for me trying to put that all together. Later, I created a game called Zooligans, which is should I call it a game? It's a puzzle, a series of puzzles in a box. I like to think of it as a game, but it is a series of puzzles of increasing difficulty. And again, I was going down the route of language independent. In fact, that's the whole selling point of the game, is that you're presented with a card. It's got a series of images, which are essentially functioning like icons, and they indicate where different things happen. You have to then place individual components to kind of piece together the picture that these icons are pointing you towards. So try to create this visual language. Through Zooligans, each individual puzzle, as they progress, they will introduce new concepts, new icons, no text. Okay, so you'll be introduced to new icons, you'll interpret them, and then they'll be used over and over again in different ways, so that you gradually learn this visual language while you play. And by the time you're getting towards the end of the cards, you know, there are 60 different puzzles in the deck, they're getting more and more complex with more and more of these icons, and some of them have things that you need to interpret, you know, you need to imagine what's happening in the story. Some of them are a case of just using the icons that you've seen previously and so on. It was a really fascinating experience putting that together, but also working with a graphic designer to get it to work. That was really intense. That was an intense month or 6 weeks, I would say, working with that graphic designer, because again, he would do things which seem great superficially, okay, on the surface they look great, but they change everything. Okay, they change the way that things are understood in relation to previous icons and future icons and game mechanisms that that graphic designer doesn't necessarily fully understand at a level that the game designer does. So I suppose I'm making a case for why graphic design should be important to you as a game designer. You need to be aware of this stuff because you're going to get involved in those conversations at a later stage. The next thing that the book goes on to talk about is diagrams. Now, I've never really made a distinction between icons and diagrams, but it makes sense, right? If you're particularly in a rule book, if you've got an example, and so it might show a series of images showing you how to carry out a turn, for example. And in this book, Daniel talks about how that can be related to comic books and how much he learned from reading comic books. It reminded me of this book, Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, which was recommended to me by one of my regular viewers on this channel. Thank you very much for that. It's a really good read. And it talks about how comics are put together and how panels work and how, you know, well, so much in that book. It's complex stuff, right? But an understanding of how comics and panels work and how readers sort of traverse the page is really useful when trying to form diagrams and use those icons and make sure that the reader is getting the most out of them and following them in a logical fashion. One of the biggest areas that this book covers that I think is of most value to us as game designers is about cards, specifically about the layout of cards. That is a big part of what we do in our prototyping, and certainly as we go into production, we're going to want to keep an eye on that to make sure that the publisher is doing what is needed to make it as easy for the players to play and read as possible. So the book talks about visibility, you know, making sure that the icons and the text are of an appropriate size. It's a complaint that's commonly thrown at Everdell, right? Everdell is my favourite game, you know, it's fantastic. But the best thing about the Everdell cards is the beautiful, beautiful artwork by Andrew Bosley, which is just incredible. This is like the major selling point for the game, frankly, isn't it? It's a fantastic game, but the artwork is amazing and it just sells the game. But as a result, that artwork is prominent on those cards, and other things, particularly the text, is really quite small, and that's going to make it quite hard for some players to read and to play. It makes it less accessible for some players. Daniel also talks about the hierarchy of the information, so where on a card certain information should be, where it should be located on the card in order to be read, where the most important information should go, and where you can sort of hide away on the card the stuff that you need to be there, but it doesn't need to be read all the time, so it can kind of be hidden in a bottom corner where it might be covered by another card at certain points and things like that. And of course the conventions that build up over time. We've got used to playing so many games that use information and present information in a certain way. We might need to follow some of that format. Daniel talks about the brevity of information, you know, keeping your text brief, making sure that your icons aren't splaying out all over the place, that they're not too complicated and so on. And I think that's important too. And then he goes on to talk about different types of cards. So he talks about playing cards. So playing cards would be a card that basically just has a number on it, right? Think about a traditional playing card where you've just got a number and a suit. Okay, and that is the case in many, many games. If we look at a game like Snack Rabbits, for example, this is just numbers and suits, you know, numbers, colours, that sort of thing. And there's so many games like that. I haven't played the game Zebra yet, but I imagine a lot of these Amigo games are just numbers, right? Numbers and colours. Something like Uno, for example, would be another example of a playing card. But then he goes on to talk about word cards, which would be similar to the cards that I would use in my game Doodle Rush, the drawing game where you've got a word that you need to then illustrate, or cards that you might see in code names, for example, where you've just got words on cards and that's it. So how do we design them? Paragraph cards, which are cards where you have long passages of text that may tell you a little bit of a story. You might see them in narrative games like Carta Ventura, or the Adventure Games series, or Clank Legacy, where you've got these long passages of text that you need to read on the card. Commodity cards, which are essentially they're basically like resources, right? So in a game like The Rich and the Good, you've got all your different resources that you're buying, all the different stocks and shares are individual cards. They could be represented by a little lump of coal or a little piece of wood, right? Little tokens. But actually in a lot of games, I guess for reasons of cost and also the functionality of passing these things around and stacking them, often they are a deck of cards. Then there's action cards, which probably take a lot of thought. Games like CCGs, a lot of Euro games, cards which you play them in order to take some sort of action. So something like Disney Lorcana, right? You play the card, it's got quite a lot of information on there about how the card works, how many attacks it has, how many defense it has, all that sort of stuff, the cost of the card. So this is where we get into looking at that hierarchy of information to make sure that everything is on there appropriately. And then cards that have an ongoing effect. So these are cards that remain on the table so that everyone can see them and they know the rules for that particular round or that particular game. This is how the game Throne, my game, works, where we've got a series of cards laid out that just set the rules for that particular round of play. Daniel goes on to talk about bleed and trim and use of layers and different card sizes. These are all things that I've covered in quite a lot of detail in my videos. I've got a video about choosing the right size for your card. I've got several videos about, trying to get trying to use the bleed and the trim to get them correctly lined up so that you can send your files off to a printer to make your prototype or to make your final product. But it's useful to have it all written down and laid out in a book, like Daniel's book about graphic design. He's got chapters on creating punch boards, game boards, talking about how game boards are manufactured. So, you've got that that sort of sticker over the front of the board that folds over onto the back of the board. And then you might have a second sticker where you put information so it's not included in the folds of those boards, thinking about the orientation of the boards so that every player is able to see information depending on where they're sat. And how that's different for a two-player game where, of course, you can have the information facing the player that needs to see it, compared to a multiplayer game where it's going to be very difficult to do that and some players are going to be seeing stuff upside down. He talks about areas of noise and quiet in the images on that board to make sure the most useful information is very visible and that the artwork is not distracting from it, but also so that you don't have massive empty spaces. He talks about how to define your worker placement spaces so that we know that this worker placement space is available for one meeple, this worker placement space is available for multiple meeples or has an additional cost to go on, all those sorts of things. He talks about laying out maps. He talks about how to choose appropriate terrain for terrain tiles for a game like Dominant Species where we've got forests and grasslands and oceans, and how to distinguish between those different terrains in a way that players can just intuitively understand at a glance. He's got a whole section on designing your rule book. He's got a section on designing boxes and packaging. So as you can tell, this is not a video right now about teaching you graphic design, right? I'm not qualified to do so, okay? I've made so many mistakes throughout my career. I'm getting better at it, okay? But I'm not good at it by any means. So this book has really, really helped me, okay? I have so many positives to say about it. I've ranted a little bit, I've raved about it here. I should probably throw in some negatives, shouldn't I? The only thing that really bothered me about the book, ironically, is the graphic design within the book itself. A lot of the diagrams, well, they're all in grayscale, right? They're all black and white images. And often the text will refer to colours and use of colours, but when those colours have then been transferred to grayscale, the image doesn't quite make sense. And sometimes I've even been left in the book reading it and looking for an image, and I'm not even sure that the image is either in the book, or maybe I'm not understanding where the image is or why the image is there. Some of the images have been shrunken so much that you can't quite make out what exactly they're trying to show you with that image. So it's a strange irony that a brilliant book about graphic design with fantastic content in it, is kind of let down a little bit by the diagrams and the images within it. Not the way that the diagrams have been intended. I'm sure if they're blown up to an appropriate scale and they have the colours and things in there, I think the diagrams would probably be really, really functional. But as they are, some of them, only some, I didn't quite get them, okay? None of that ruined the book, okay? None of that changed the fact that I learned so much from it. And I think you would probably learn something from it too if you're a game designer. So I would highly recommend having a look for it. It's called The Graphic Design for Board Games by Daniel Solis, and it's produced by CRC Press from the Taylor and Francis Group. And I think it's one of a new series of books that Jeff Engelstein is overseeing. Okay, so there's already been one which is all about theme. I haven't seen that. I'd quite like to look at that one. Maybe I'll have a look at that as well. And then I think there are future books planned. And I also think Jeff Engelstein is I've seen him reaching out to designers asking, does anybody else want to produce a book on a specific topic that might fit into this range? So you might want to consider that as well. So there you go, graphic design for board games. Go and find yourself a copy. If you enjoyed this, you might enjoy some of my books. So I'm going to share a link.